Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the AARP ROI webinar, The New World Order of Site Deselection. Doesn't that sound exciting? Our two presenters today, we're going to go ladies first, is Rebecca Maudry, Vice President for Business Development with ROI, and good friend of AARP, Stephen Jast, President of ROI. Let me take a few minutes and introduce our prestigious VIPs. It gives tremendous context to their depth on the topic. Rebecca joined ROI, Research on Investment, in early 2017 as Vice President for Business Development. As part of the executive team at ROI, Rebecca supports the economic development community in business attraction efforts. She serves on the steering committee of lead generation programs for organizations across the country and across industries to help guide successful implementation. She's also played a key role in creating and developing lead generation and FDI attraction training programs for economic development organizations and is a trainer for the International Economic Development Council, IEDC, Foreign Direct Investment and Exporting Advanced course. Rebecca has 15 years of experience leading economic development and investment promotion programs. Prior to joining ROI, Rebecca was a Deputy Director for Investment Services at Select USA, the U.S. federal program to facilitate investment in the United States. In this role, Rebecca was responsible for leading an international team to promote the United States as an investment destination and serving businesses and U.S. economic development organizations. Now, Stephen Jast. As president of ROI, Stephen led the growth of ROI Research on Investment from a two-person startup in 2003 to a Profit Magazine Hot 50 company, having posted revenue growth over 300% and becoming Canada's 26th fastest growing company in 2007. Stephen was further recognized as a finalist in the E&Y International Entrepreneur of the Year competition in 2006. Prior to founding ROI, Stephen was partner and executive vice president at CAI, Corporate Affairs International, a boutique selection corporate practice for about 10 years. And most recently, Stephen has been leading an ambitious R&D effort to harness the power of big data and artificial intelligence in the world of investment attraction, the Gazelle platform, which I hope he will share a few more details during the presentation. Now, before I turn the program over to our experts, let me just review a few housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded for others to enjoy that have conflicts today with their schedules or they're not able to join us. Hence, all the microphones will be turned off. If you have a question, please use the chat and send your questions to me directly, and I will share them at the end of the presentation. Follow-up questions that you would like to address individually with our presenters, I'm sure they're open to that. Please write them down throughout the presentation, and I'm sure that Stephen and Rebecca will share their contact information at the end of the session as well. So let me now turn it over to our experts, and Steve, I think you're going to be kicking us off. Go ahead, Steve.
Thanks very much, Carol. Thanks for the introduction. Rebecca and I are thrilled to be here today in the second of our series of webinars dealing with investment attraction and site selection. So in the last webinar that we put on for the AARP, we talked a little bit about how important benchmark assessment is and learning what your value proposition is in advance of your investment attraction strategy. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about site selection and some of the changes the site selection process has undergone over the course of the past 10 years or so. We're also going to talk a little bit about what firms are looking for and how they find it. So as an administrator or a business development professional at an economic development organization or a research park, obviously you're trying to attract companies to come set up shop inside of your park. So we're going to share a little bit about, I think, some of the most important data points that companies are looking at in the earliest portions, the earliest segments of the site selection decision-making process, and where they go to find that information. And then how to position your community to target. So again, we'll talk a little bit about benchmark. We'll talk a little bit about how you want to market your park or your region globally to companies who may be considering a new or expanded R&D or manufacturing type of facility. And again, as Carol mentioned throughout the presentation, if you do have any questions, please feel free to pass them along to Carol, and then Carol will pass them along to us. So without any further ado, let's jump right in. I'll spend just a really quick couple of slides to talk about our company. Carol did a great job introducing us. So ROI, we're a company of about 60 people. We speak about 25 languages. Our primary goal is investment attraction and lead generation for the economic development community. We also do some work a little bit upstream in advance of lead generation, so benchmark assessment, target industry studies. We also do a lot of work in training. So we do help economic development organizations from around the world better understand what companies are telling us as it relates to the kinds of data that they need to make informed decisions and how they're going about making those decisions. Okay, so how and why the site selection process has changed. Before I get into some of the major changes in site selection, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that haven't changed and some of the things that I don't think ever will change. And for those of you who may have joined me in the last webinar, I did show this slide, and I think it's such a fundamentally important slide that we're going to start off today's webinar talking a little bit about the sort of the pillars, the foundation to the site selection decision-making process. Every company is very much aware of and trying to mitigate risk as much as possible. Risk aversion is the #1 criteria in the site selection decision-making process. Capital is precious, time is precious, resources are precious. The last thing that anybody wants to do are waste any of these resources. So risk mitigation is always #1. So when we're talking to a company who's interested in locating in our jurisdiction, we always have to be very upfront about talking about how we're going to mitigate risk. Of course, risk has a lot to do with money, and it has a lot to do with speed. And when we talk about money and speed, we're talking about how much of an investment will be required up front. If it's more in one jurisdiction versus another, is not necessarily going to position one jurisdiction or one park more favorably or poorly. And what I mean by that is, if it's a higher upfront investment in one location, but risk is averted and the speed to profitability, the speed to marketability, the speed to commercialization is shortened, well then our tolerance for a higher upfront investment is greater. So anytime we're talking about the site selection decision-making process, always keep in mind the 3 pillars: speed, risk, and money. Okay, so the site selection process in the 1990s. I started my career as a site selection consultant back in 1993. And back in those days, there was no internet, there was no email. And when a company was going to start out in the process of looking where it might want to expand to, it almost had to get in touch with the local economic development organization, because that's where you went to get the data that you needed to come to an informed decision on where you wanted to expand to. However, I think one of the key changes in the site selection decision-making process, whoops, I touched the wrong button, is the shortening of the process as it relates to the implication of the economic development or the research park administration. If we look at the star, the shortening of that distance between the research process and the go, no-go decision has been shortened tremendously. Why is that? Well, today, real estate executives, site selection consultants don't need to liaise with economic development professionals in the earliest portions of the decision-making process, because most of the data is now online. It's easily accessible. The proliferation of data in the digital world has made it such that interpersonal contact with the economic development organization is really not as necessary at the very earliest stages. It's only once a company has chosen a short list of potential locations where very often the local, again, business park or economic development professional will get involved in the process from an advisory capacity. So at this point, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Rebecca, and then I will chime my 2 cents back in a little bit later in the presentation. So I'm going to pass the screen over to Rebecca, if you just bear with me. Okay, Rebecca Moundry.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. It's an honor to be here with all of you today and focus on this topic. So let's just kind of continue this conversation and move into a little bit of data and really look at the numbers and understand what firms are looking for and how they're going about finding that information. So, of course, it's not just data that's changed the world of company site location. When we go back to that slide that Steve showed of speed, risk, and money, one of the most significant drivers for all of those today is a trained and relevant workforce. And that impacts costs, that greatly impacts the ability of a company to reach their market in a timely manner. And for that and many other reasons, kind of the world of site selection has changed. And this graph, this chart kind of points to that. So on the left-hand side, we see that previously firm recruitment was a primary driver of this kind of economic development wheel. And from there, communities or economic development organizations often looked then to bring in the right people for those companies that they recruited. And then over time and sometimes across generations, those communities would focus on quality of life and providing the people and the companies in their location with amenities and services. Well, that has completely flipped now. Really at the top of this economic development wheel, it's not necessarily the firm itself and recruiting those companies, but the people. So as available and skilled workforce contracts, finding and keeping employees is a huge cost issue for companies. So if communities have the right people, then the firms will come. Research over many years have shown that, that companies follow people and not the other way around. And often finding the right people and recruiting and retaining the right people starts with placemaking or quality of life initiatives. And from there, once the people are in place, communities and economic developers and research parks can go about attracting the right companies. So all of you likely have a real leg up in this process because of your access to trained and skilled professionals. So let's get a little bit back to kind of what firms are looking for. And really, the cold hard numbers don't lie. So in a survey that we conducted, more than 3/4 of site selectors told us that they don't reach out to EDOs in the initial phase of their research or when they're developing that long list of options. And when they do eventually make contact, they're actually checking out your website first. So the question is, are you sharing the right information and telling the right story? So let's hold that question for a minute while we look at kind of a converse survey of firms. So here we have the company's perspective in terms of their decision process. And it's very interesting, this first bullet reveals that most companies these days are not even using an outside consultant or a site selector. They're using perhaps inside resources or existing staff to do the research, to compare locations, and create lists of suitable sites. We also found here that most companies take 1 or more years to gather information and make a decision, but once they identify a potential location, most executives are reaching out to economic developers relatively quickly, within 3 to 6 months. And of course, most firms have a very narrow shortlist. Their shortlist is just 1 to 5 locations. So
Rebecca,
again, you need,
sorry,
yeah.
Rebecca, can I interrupt? It looks like a couple people are having audio problems. Vanessa, have you identified the issue?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I don't see anybody other than Kim, but I muted her, so.
Okay, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear, that's all.
I think it's more she wasn't able to speak.
Okay, perfect.
Than to hear, yeah,
okay.
From what I understand.
Great, thank you.
Are you all,
interruption,
can
Rebecca.
you all hear me okay? Carol and Vanessa, can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
Yep, just fine.
All right. Sure, let's move on. So this is kind of an interesting comparison of what firms versus site selectors say about reaching out to economic development organizations. So the first line indicates that firms, which are in blue, or the kind of top little bullet there, are much less likely to reach out to economic development organizations than site selectors. And if most firms these days aren't using a site selector, then this is kind of important information in terms of your own outreach and your own targeting efforts to be in touch with the right firms at the right time. Another kind of finding from this survey is that the third line, if you check that out, companies are much more likely to not reach out at all in any stage of a site location search. And there could be a lot of reasons for this. I mean, clearly site selectors are connected to the economic development community, but perhaps companies don't know that EDOs can assist them to find the right site, the right workers. And so the onus is really on us, on economic development organizations or communities that have available sites to proactively reach out and let companies know of the many assets and services that you can provide to them. So I know there's a lot of data in here. Bear with me. This is all kind of part of the larger story that we're telling here. But another piece, this just gets back to the labor availability, how important it is right now to companies in terms of looking for the right site in the right location. So this is a survey done just this year, and from 5 years ago, labor availability didn't even show up as a at the top of the list as a reason for domestic relocation. And here we see that it's towards the top. A lot of companies are mentioning it. And at the very top are facilities and infrastructure. And this, of course, is interesting from a research park perspective because facilities and infrastructure are certainly among the assets that you all have and can highlight. So this next slide shows a survey that's done every single year. It's the A.T. Kearney FDI Confidence Index. So this surveys global executives about their confidence or about their perceptions of different markets, as well as the factors that they take into consideration when they make a foreign investment. And the top 5 often stay quite the same, but labor cost comes on strong and has gotten stronger and stronger over the years in terms of a top factor. There is higher emphasis on regulatory transparency and lack of corruption. So these are just kind of interesting components to take into place when you're developing your message. One thing that is kind of interesting is that incentives isn't in the top 5 for any year that we analyzed here. So this is a topic that's often brought up, the importance of incentives, but in terms of global executives, it's not often a top consideration. And actually, I wanted to note that in this corporate survey on the last slide, incentives also was not in a top consideration for domestic relocation. What I've highlighted on this slide are, again, factors that are most relevant for, I think, a research park, the technological and innovation capabilities and R&D capabilities. So these are among the top factors. This slide is showing the top 14 from the 2008 survey. The full list is top 20. So clearly, these 2 factors are important to executives and can be highlighted by research parks. And finally, I wanted to pull out this information. This is a survey showing most useful features of an economic development organization's website. So I do find it interesting that while companies and site selectors say that incentives don't necessarily drive their location decision, it came out at the top in terms of what they may be looking at an EDO's website. So this helps paint a picture of the type of information that you want to make sure is available. So the top 5 are incentives, demographic information, available buildings and sites, workforce statistics, and comparisons to competitor locations. This, of course, is going to differ by industry, but what's most important is that you have this information up there. You have it clear, it's available, so that site selectors and firms, when they visit your website, can easily access it, and from there, potentially reach out. And a survey that we conducted with site selectors, we asked, what are your recommendations about how to increase your profile with site selectors? And their number one recommendation across the board was update your website. And finally, this is kind of a very interesting time series chart that show the leading sources of information that influence companies' perceptions of a location. So what I'd like to highlight here is that this top line, dialogue with industry peers, this has been an important factor since 1996, when I believe this survey was initiated. So this points to the importance of ongoing engagement with your existing employers, with companies that are in your park, in your region, because they are out there talking with their peers, and their peers are asking them about your location and if it's a good place to invest and expand. So that ongoing engagement is clearly important. It has gone down, and that's not much of a surprise. So in 1996, it was ranked much higher, and dialogue with industry peers was ranked much higher as a source of information. While, of course, a lot has changed since 1996, clearly companies and site selectors are able to get information about locations in different ways. And that's kind of a primary point in our presentation today. So while that's gone down, other factors have, of course, increased, like online resources, which didn't really exist in 1996, as well as social media. Other things that have of course decreased significantly are articles and newspapers as a major source of information. And this is the last kind of data-heavy slide, but this is just a real quick look at what companies and site selectors have indicated are the most effective marketing techniques that they find. So no surprise here, really leveraging online resources and direct engagement and promotion through your website and through the internet is a significant factor. So from here, I'm going to turn it back over to Steve really quick, and he's going to kind of take us to the next section and bring us home. So let me do this. Okay, Steve, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Okay, let me get started here. Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So we're going to talk a little bit now about how to position your community, how to position your research park to companies, given some of the changes that we know have taken place and how companies are selecting the spots from which they want to operate. We're very big proponents of data. And again, if anybody has participated in the last webinar, we showed this same slide. We feel like it's very important to have strong data analytics from three different perspectives: from a marketing perspective, from what we call a positioning perspective, and then of course to help us with our outreach strategy moving forward. So let me spend a couple of minutes in talking to you about some of the different data points that I think are important in each one of these three. From a marketing perspective, we like to talk about multi-touch outreach, and Rebecca spent a lot of time talking about how important it is to have a website that features data that's most important to companies, and obviously to keep that data refreshed. But a website is only as good as the different methods that we're using to drive traffic to the website and drive traffic to the various kinds of messaging that we want to deploy to companies that we think may be interested in setting up in our jurisdiction, in our business park, in our research park. So we talk about social means, and when we talk about social means, we want to know who's visiting our website, who's reading our messaging, who's reading our blogs, who's looking at our LinkedIn site. And by doing that, we get a better idea of our conversion rates. So which leads are converting to prospects, which ones of these prospects are converting into actual potential business development opportunities for us. And the way to truly maximize our marketing dollars is to understand which vehicles are converting these leads at the highest rates. So it's very important to have a platform or somebody responsible for these kinds of analytics to make sure that our marketing spend is optimized over the different channels that we have, again, to drive traffic to our website. Again, if nobody knows we exist, it's very hard to position ourselves, and it's hard to market our value proposition and our unique selling proposition to the world. So very important to constantly be checking on your analytics and then tweaking your marketing spend based on your conversion rate. The next component is what we call positioning. So we need to understand our research park. We need to understand our community before we can really engage in any effective marketing. And so what do we mean by proactive positioning and having a good positioning strategy? Well, in our last webinar, we talked a lot about benchmark assessment and value proposition. Every single research park, every single county, every single MSA, every state, every country has a series of value propositions, something where they're positioned a little bit more favorably than a comparator region. So these are the real strengths that we want to be marketing to the world. So I'm a strong believer in having a research park and having a specific jurisdiction go through a benchmark assessment, go through a SWOT analysis, and come out the other end with a unique selling proposition that then becomes the real voice of the research park, of the community, as it relates to the value proposition, as it relates to why companies should take a harder look at setting up an operation in that particular location. We obviously need workforce analysis. What are the skill sets that we have present within our community? How are they transferable? If there's one particular skill set that translates nicely into a different kind of occupation, if we're rich in a particular occupation, but those skills are transferable to one which we want to try and attract to our region, we need to understand that. Where's our workforce coming from? What are the driving times? Have we done a GIS analysis of our workforce? So given the competition as it relates for workforce, and given the incredibly low unemployment rates that we currently are seeing across the U.S., as Rebecca was mentioning a bit earlier, the driving force in site selection has almost become, attract the people and then will attract the companies, whereas it used to be, build it and they will come. So we need to understand where our workforce is coming from and how we can attract workforce. Industry trends and market research. We need to stay on top of the different kinds of assets that specific industry requires to thrive and make sure that we have those assets present in our communities. From a market research perspective, do we have a cluster? Do we have a viable market? Maybe a little bit less important from a research park perspective, but very often companies will locate themselves in a jurisdiction that has a large addressable market for products and services that they're selling, or at the very least, do they have access to a large addressable market that is interested in the products and services that they're producing. So very important to understand the addressable market, as well as proximity to key suppliers of goods and services when a company is considering a particular jurisdiction. Important to have that data on hand. And then, of course, it's always great to understand our cluster. Is our cluster growing? Is there significant leakage in our cluster? Companies like to be located near like companies. So very often when a company is in its site selection decision-making process, it'll want to know if the cluster that the company operates within is growing, is it shrinking, are there other companies considering locating as well. So keeping an active eye on the status of your cluster is very important. So once we understand how effective our marketing strategy is from a multi-touch outreach perspective, once we understand who we are from a positioning perspective, we're in a very good position to execute a data-supported strategy, which would include, as we talked a bit about before, more effective multi-touch outreach, targeting better prospects, because now that we've done cluster analysis, we can see not only how our cluster is growing, but we've also taken the time to see where other clusters are growing. And in doing a benchmark assessment, we know the strengths and weaknesses of competitive clusters in other jurisdictions. Gathering business intelligence. What are the key drivers, motivators, barriers, and triggers to expansion of individual companies that we want to be attracting? We can then start our corporate calls, and we can start using different kinds of data platforms. So know thy cluster. A cluster is not strong without a strong supply chain. So we talked a little bit in the past slide about knowing where the key suppliers are of goods and services, the companies that you want to attract. That will ultimately be a question they will ask. So within a 1 day's drive, what does the ecosystem potential suppliers look like? Knowing thy cluster also defends against cluster leakage. So cluster leakage is when we have companies in a particular cluster in a particular region that need to go outside of that region for support in terms of products and services they need to continue their operations. So the benefit of knowing the buying and selling ecosystem, of knowing your cluster, is you can create better stickiness from a business retention and expansion perspective. We're better armed to keep our companies that we currently have from leaving. And of course, it'll work to help us attract companies, provide an attractive business environment for new investments. Data growth versus size. This is a debate that I have very often with colleagues in the world of investment attraction and economic development. I think that a lot of economic development and business development practitioners are always very interested in trying to attract big logos with prolific budgets, deep pockets, strong balance sheets. Of course, we all want that. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that diversification is also very important. I think that in having a blend of different kinds of companies within a prospect list, which includes large, well-established companies as well as growth companies, is very important. I read a statistic somewhere where something like half of the world's billion-dollar companies by 2025 don't even exist today. So it's always very important to keep an eye on fast growth businesses. And when we talk about fast growth businesses, we talk about sustained growth companies. These are companies that have 2 or more years of significant growth over a 6-year period. We also talk about gazelle growth companies. These are defined as companies that have combined annual growth rates of 20% for 5 years in a row, doubling in size every 5 years. These companies, when you average them together, typically represent about 3% of all companies in a given economy. However, they also represent over 60% of net new jobs in a given year. They also fight above their weight class in terms of R&D expense, capital expenditure, and because they're such prolific spenders in R&D, they're also widely responsible for a lot of innovation. So again, very important when we're targeting, not just to target the big guys. It's always nice to have the big guys, but also keep an eye out for the fast-growing smaller companies. Or you know, I'm going to correct myself. Gazelle and sustained growth companies does not necessarily mean that they're small companies. They can be mid-sized, they could be larger. By definition, a gazelle growth company isn't necessarily a small company. They're just fast growth companies. So how do we know if a company is a fast-growing company? Well, it's difficult, to be quite honest. There's no real easy answer to that. You know, people used to think that change in C-level staffing was indicative of a company on the move. If they're recruiting senior resources in non-traditional markets, this will certainly be a signal that the company is more interested in foreign direct investment. What we have seen is that strong employee benefits, pension plan growth, defined contribution growth, defined benefit growth are indicative of corporate expansion. Gary Kunkel Gary Kunkel wrote a study called the Virtuous Growth Cycle, which drew a direct correlation between pension plan growth and a company's ability to grow. And I think the thinking there was that employees who are compensated for helping the company grow learn a behavior, and they want to repeat that behavior to help the company continue to grow, so they themselves can also benefit from the growth of the business. And he measured this by looking at different companies' pension plan growth. We can look backwards also, and companies typically that have expanded physically over the past 5 years are more likely to expand moving forward. We can use different kinds of signals that are available today that weren't available years ago, such as job posting intensity. This is the measure by which a company is posting online for new positions. If a company has recently translated its website from one language to another, that would also be a clear indication that they're probably looking at entering a new marketplace. Certainly from a selling perspective, typically speaking, when a company is effective at selling into a jurisdiction, it will more often than not eventually set up some kind of operations in that jurisdiction as well. Patent applications, changed addresses, acquisitions, joint ventures. These are all obviously indicative of corporate expansion. VC funding also is remarkable from a perspective of company growth. If we see significant VC funding, then that company has been mandated by its provider of venture capital to grow the business. So it goes without saying that they will be looking to bring in new people and likely will need to expand their physical presence as well. So how do we find these companies? Well, there's all kinds of different heat maps that we can use. We'll give you a use case that I think is example. So right now what we're looking is at a county-based heat map of companies with strong revenue growth and job growth. So these are two strong indicators of companies that are growing, obviously. If a company is hiring lots of people and they're generating lots of new revenue. But, buyer beware. Very often companies, and I know I might sound like I'm going to contradict myself, but nothing is quite so easy in this world. Companies that are growing really fast, these companies are typically under a lot of stress from a working capital perspective. The debt to cash ratios can also not be optimal given the fact that they need to fund this tremendous growth. So always keep an eye out, a cautious eye out for companies that are growing really, really fast. But to add to this formula of this heat map that we're looking at, which combines revenue with job growth, what we can also look at are jurisdictions that have strong, or not strong, I should say, but high average salary growth. So what would that tell us? Okay, well, these companies are growing from a revenue perspective, they're growing from an employment perspective, but the jurisdictions that they're in are growing very fast from an average salary growth perspective. So that tells us that these companies are likely going to be suffering from eroding margins, given the fact that they're in counties in the US with very high average salary growth. It probably also tells us that these companies are having trouble recruiting people. Workforce works much in the same way that the economy as a whole works, meaning if there's not enough supply to meet demand, prices will go up, prices here in the form of salaries. So from a recruiting perspective, from a messaging perspective, from a value proposition perspective, if we know that we're operating in a jurisdiction that has more competitive average salary growth, if we know that we're more competitive from a workforce availability perspective, then if these companies that are operating in these particular counties are expanding, they would be very sympathetic to listening to your case, given the fact that you have many of the ingredients that this company needs to thrive into the future. So those are some techniques from a site selection perspective that I would deploy in my targeting strategy. So that's it for today's webinar. And certainly, Carol, if there are any questions, I believe we have about 15 or 20 minutes, and Rebecca and I would be thrilled to answer any.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve and Rebecca. Super information. I can't write fast enough. We have these webinars, which is great. That's why they're recorded, so we can go back and pick up little pieces later. One of the things that I have a question. So one of the shocking stats that I picked up on this time was 68% of companies do the site selection themselves. I know that we are, fascinated with the Site Selectors Guild and the site selector profession. How do you suggest that, and we put a lot of effort into that. One of the things that you say in regards to that is that we should be doing outreach to companies conveying our assets of our parks and our districts. But how do you typically do that rather than going after like a Site Selectors Guild? How do we target the companies we want then? And what's the best way to communicate with them on a regular basis about the assets we have that would benefit their company? What have you seen works in the past, and what are the normal ways they like to receive information?
Rebecca, do you want to take a shot at that, or do you want me to go ahead?
Well, I'll start, and then and you can finish. Well, I'm glad that you kind of picked up on that, because I also think it's very interesting, because I mean, clearly site selectors are an important piece of kind of the economic development community, and like everything, there's a balance that needs to be struck. So putting all your eggs in a site locator basket may not be the wisest of choices, and this stat really kind of highlights that. So the other pieces of information, of course, that came out through all of the other surveys and details is really how companies themselves are accessing information. So again, they talk to each other, but of course, more and more, they are using online resources. And I think many of them are kind of really wading through the site selection process themselves. Companies often do not have a lot of experience in doing their own site selection. Some do. Some have multiple sites and they have a team and a system in place to do that. But many really could use the expertise and guidance and information that come directly from economic development organizations. So with that, Steve, I'll let you kind of take it from there.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. I think, Cal, part of your question was how to best communicate our messaging to companies. And when we looked at the numbers over the course of the past 15 or 20 years that Rebecca showed us, I think a few of them have stayed pretty constant. So many companies and site selection consultants will start their search online. So it's extremely important to make sure that we have a website that includes all of the latest information, and that also, in a best case scenario, benchmarks the research park or the jurisdiction against potential competing and comparator regions. So very often what we'll see on an economic development website is a section that's clearly labeled site selection. And you click into that particular section of the website, and it's full of data and information related to workforce availability, workforce cost, energy cost, all of the key criteria that a site selection consultant would need to either shortlist or deselect that particular jurisdiction. And I think it's also very important to have an up-to-date GIS listing of all available facilities. So very often, site selection consultants will come on, they'll have a very specific requirement for a client. If it's a manufacturer, a certain ceiling height, a certain slab that they might require. And it's very helpful to know if those kinds of facilities exist in the jurisdiction that they're looking at. So to keep a very active real estate listing posted on a GIS platform, so the site selection consultant can go ahead and look. Now, obviously, for a research park, we're not talking about heavy manufacturing, but how many square feet of office space are available immediately in the coming months, et cetera. So there's website. We also saw that one of the very popular ways for companies to make their value proposition known to, rather, one of the popular ways for economic development organizations to make their assets known to companies is through company visits. So, it's very old school, but it still ranks very highly. Companies really are very appreciative of when economic development professionals, or for that matter, research park administrators, business development professionals, go to meet with them and talk to them specifically about the assets of their park. We call this propositional marketing. So it's when we actually draw a list of companies that we want to get in front of. We go pitch our value proposition and pitch how that company could enhance its bottom line by being present in our research park. Companies, they're not, okay, I was going to say that they're not philanthropic charitable organizations. I mean, some of them can be, but I mean, really, they're in business to do business, and they're in business to have a bottom line. And then if they have a strong bottom line, they can become charitable. But it's very incumbent upon us as business development professionals to show a company how it can enhance its bottom line. So when we talk about propositional marketing, let's go meet with companies that we feel really could benefit by being in our jurisdiction, and let's go and show them how they can benefit from a bottom line perspective by being in our research park. So those are two ways, but I think that what I'll end this very long answer to a short question is by saying that in 2018, we call it multi-touch outreach, which means that no one particular means of outreach is really going to far surpass another. It's really a question of blending and diversifying all of your communication. Do some communication by email, some communication by snail mail, some communication by social media, some communication face-to-face. It really needs to be a blend. And then you need to sort of, going back to the visual that I had, you need to go back to all your different types of outreach and see what's converting best for you as an organization. And then, try and do as much of that kind of marketing as you possibly can based on the analytics, based on the numbers.
Perfect. I wondered if that, proposition marketing and being face-to-face was still a really common element within the, closing of foreign direct investment. And I'm glad to hear that it is, because half that meeting is about listening and finding out what the real pains are for those organizations.
Absolutely. It still very much is a face-to-face relationship building type of a process. It's very complex. It's not easy. It can be very sort of anxiety generating for somebody who's going to be investing into a new country for the very first time. Yeah. So if we're able to allay that anxiety, if we're able to become what we call a value-added partner, then most definitely, our community stands a better chance to being to receiving foreign direct investments, based on those very, very traditional concepts of relationship building and delivering more than what's asked of us, to show that we really are very committed to the process.
Great. It's a contact sport, as I always refer to it.
100%. Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more.
Perfect. One of the, a question that's come through is, have you done any work with opportunity zones? Because many of the research parks in the US are located in opportunity zones, and just wanted to get both of your feedback on the opportunities, the trends. What's the latest that you're hearing on those?
Well, Rebecca, do you want to start?
I don't have tons to add. So I'll just say I'm familiar with opportunity zones. And it hasn't come up significantly in kind of my interaction with economic development organizations in terms of, or from companies in terms of what they're specifically, looking for, as in, that's a criteria for them. But clearly it's an asset that can be communicated, again, because of the benefits that they offer, potential, cost savings and others. An asset that can be directly and clearly communicated to companies, keeping it simple, how it translates to a benefit directly to the firm.
Good idea.
Right. Well, I think that sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that the main benefit of the opportunity zones is tax related, right? So there's a tax incentive for investors to reinvest their unrealized, right? So, I don't know how well the opportunity zones have been marketed, quite honestly. I don't hear opportunity. I'm familiar with the concept. I'm familiar with some of the tax relief, but it has not come up in the mainstream conversations, for a lot of the work that we've been doing. So I think that the opportunity zone concept is a strong one, obviously. But I can't say that it's really front and center in a lot of discussions, to Rebecca's point, that I've been having in the recent past. Given, in all honesty, it only really came into effect as of 2017. Yeah. So perhaps it's going to take a little bit of time for companies to become more familiar with them, which perhaps is the point.
The buzz right now, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe maybe it's not much past buzz at this point. I don't even know if it's all been finalized, but I know that there's lots of conversations around that topic. I know that at the international conference in College Park, Maryland, that we're going to be having a couple of sessions on the opportunity zones, because it is this mystery entity that we know should be an asset, but we don't know how to leverage it at this point. And so I was just wondering if you guys had anything to add to that.
No, and they're very spread out as well, right? They're sort of all over the place, the opportunity zone. But I think definitely that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, Rebecca, go ahead.
Well, in terms of leveraging it, clearly these are, opportunity zones are kind of a repackaging and kind of some new components, but these are not the first zones that have been out there, right? There's empowerment zones and there were hub zones. And so I think the question, are there good examples of how the benefits, the direct benefits of those and other, tax credits, certainly companies and organizations that are in the know that use this, they get it. And so they will kind of seek those out. But many firms do not know and do not understand, and it's complicated. And so, what are and probably the annual conference will highlight this. What are good examples of translating, this kind of long, program and requirements and application process? How can you take that and essentially be the translator for the company and help them, identify assets that fit with what they're looking for and benefit because they can locate in a zone. So that's the key piece, I'd say.
I also think that a lot of the opportunity zones are, and correct me if I'm wrong, Carol, but I think they're mostly economically depressed regions that can benefit from status of opportunity zones. So I think a lot of them probably suffer from, maybe not having the best of assets or the best of infrastructure. Now, I don't know that for sure, but I'm just putting it out there right now that I think that was really the goal, was to spur on development in these opportunity zones because they were the zones that needed it the most.
Yeah, and there's hundreds of them. I mean, I think almost every community could spin, how an opportunity zone could benefit them in some way. So, and there's hundreds of them that have been tagged. But I agree with Rebecca that it's how do we translate that into a direct benefit for the companies that we want to attract to our parks and to our community. Last final words. We're coming down to the wire. Is there any final comments? We all want to know about Amazon HQ too, and you guys are in the industry. And is there any thing that you're hearing in that way?
I do have some clients that are finalists. I will admit that, and I have been asking questions, and nobody's telling me anything.
Really?
And I've asked them very well. They've all had to sign non-disclosures. But all I can say from asking the questions is that I've asked, has there been any, have you been told that you're no longer under consideration, or that there's been, another round of sort of, cuts that have been made, and I think that information is at a premium right now. Really, to be quite honest, as much as I've asked, and yes, I do have a number of clients who are finalists. Either they're really great at keeping a secret, or I just don't know that they know anything. I think it's been a long, very confidential process. So I wish I could tell all of the listeners that I know something and that I could share it with them, but honestly, I just don't. And I've stopped asking to that point, to tell you the truth.
Do we know the date when? Because we've heard fall, but we're officially in fall now. So have we heard any dates that we're working towards?
Like I said, I thought that they already missed their initial deadline of when they'd have an application finally selected. So I don't know, Rebecca, have you heard anything differently?
No, and I'm here in Washington, D.C. So there are 4 counties in DC that are in the running, and I, chat with different people, and I also, it's like mum's the word. There's no real even activity to track, who's going where visits, like it's really under the radar. Yeah.
I've had a couple of clients who had Amazon folks visit their communities short after the final 20 were named. And this was a while ago, and I haven't heard anything since.
Wow. Crazy. Now, just comment on Amazon and the exercise they went through and the amount of data that they collected. I mean, for a data-driven organization like yourselves, that must be just, that must have been really interesting to watch from afar.
It was, and I think it caught a lot of economic development practitioners off guard. I think that one of the main lessons that a lot of the folks in our industry learned was that they need to keep their data very much up to date on an ongoing basis. Again, I know that I have some clients who were really scrambling at the last second to pull the kind of data together that Amazon requested. So yes, everybody has basic data, some basic infrastructure data. Everybody has workforce data, but the kinds of questions and the kinds of more involved and intricate data that Amazon was asking for, I think a few of them struggled with. Ultimately, they were able to put it together, but I think the main lesson learned was that, we really are in a data world, and we really need to make sure that we have somebody on staff, or at least that we have, somebody keeping that data up to date and keeping a finger on all the different kinds of all the different kinds of data that are becoming more and more available. You never know what you're going to get asked.
That's right. That's right. I think we're officially hit our mark on time. There's a few more questions out there. I'm going to recommend that people email you both directly, Steve and Rebecca, but thank you very much for your time today. And we also look forward to having you, Steve. I know, Steve, you're going to be at the conference with the session. So we look forward to you expanding on this series that you've been presenting and working with AARP. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Steve.
Okay, Rebecca's going to be at the conference as well. So we both look forward to seeing you, Carol, and anybody else, and all the AARP members, sponsors, et cetera. Look forward to seeing everybody. And thank you so much for allowing us to put on the webinar today, Carol, and look forward to speaking with you real soon. It's been a lot of fun.
That's great. Super interesting. Thanks, guys.